In the past, entering into orbit around a planet or moon required precise navigation and the ability to slow a spacecraft with thrusters. Of course, thrusters require large amounts of fuel to slow the craft down to orbital speeds. The fuel carried on these missions takes up valuable space, which can be used to store science instruments. To help reduce costs and create more room, NASA researchers have developed an alternative to using fuel to slow the craft, called aerobraking. Aerobraking uses the atmosphere of the target planet as both a brake and a steering wheel to slow the craft. Jennifer Pulley spoke with Dr. Mary Kay Lockwood to find out more about aerobraking and how NASA is using this technique in space travel. The sight of spacecraft flying out of the atmosphere on the way to a distant destination is a familiar one to most of us. In order to break free of the Earth's gravitational field, a typical spacecraft needs to be traveling at speeds close to 25,000 miles per hour. Once the spacecraft does break free, it is able to continue traveling to its destination at high speeds because there is very little friction to slow it down. Once the craft reaches its destination, the craft must decelerate from very high speeds to much lower speeds in a relatively short period of time. In the past, additional thrusters would be fired to help the craft decelerate as it approached its target. But a major problem with this method is that the fuel needed for these thrusters takes up valuable space and weight, which could be used to house additional science instruments. More recently, NASA has been using an aero assist technique called aerobraking, which adds the use of atmospheric drag to slow the craft rather than using thrusters alone. This technique allows additional science instruments to be delivered to a distant target, while also reducing costs. I spoke to Dr. Mary Kay Lockwood at NASA Langley Research Center to find out more.
Well, when we first approach a planet on a trajectory from Earth, we do a small firing of the thrusters and capture into a very large elliptical orbit about that planet. We then do several passes through the upper atmosphere of that destination to slow the spacecraft down into the final science orbit.
Aerobraking is accomplished when a vehicle makes multiple passes around a planet or moon and uses the atmosphere to slow down the vehicle. This process is very slow, sometimes taking several months because the vehicle is only exposed to the upper layers of the atmosphere. This procedure is very similar to how a rock reacts when it is skimmed across the top of water. With each skip, the rock slows down until it finally stops. The spacecraft is similar because with each pass through the atmosphere, it slows down more and more until it finally reaches the appropriate orbital speed. Has the aerobraking technique ever been flown on a mission?
Well, aerobraking was first demonstrated in the Magellan mission at the very end of the mission at Venus. And it has since flown in 2 successful Mars missions, both the Mars Global Surveyor mission and Mars Odyssey. It's also going to be used in the future on the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter mission.
Once a vehicle nears its destination, how does the atmosphere slow it down?
Well, an atmosphere slows a vehicle down in the same way that if you were to put your hand out the window of a car while it's moving, you can feel the force of the air on your hand. And that is the same force that's slowing the spacecraft down when it passes through the atmosphere. Aerobraking is a good way to slow a vehicle down at a destination and capture into an orbit, but we're also looking at another approach called Aerocapture.
Aerocapture is similar to aerobraking because it uses the atmosphere to slow a vehicle down. But unlike aerobraking, which only skims the top layers of the atmosphere, the Aerocapture technique allows the vehicle to go deep inside the atmosphere of the target. The vehicle maneuvers through the atmosphere using drag to decelerate to the desired orbital speed. After the vehicle exits the atmosphere, a very small thruster firing occurs to achieve the desired orbit around the target planet or moon.
One of the major differences between aerobraking and aerocapture is that for aerocapture we need an aeroshell. And an aeroshell is very much the same as the aeroshell used on the Mars Exploration Rover missions you may be familiar with. But for aerocapture, of course, we're maneuvering through the atmosphere and then exiting the atmosphere and finally achieving an orbit at a destination, where with the Mars Exploration Rovers we were landing on the surface of that destination. For aerobraking, you do not need an aeroshell because you're passing through the very upper part of the atmosphere. So the heating environment on the vehicle is not nearly as severe as it is with Aerocapture.
So do different planets need different shaped aeroshells, or will one design work in all situations?
The aeroshell shape for the Aerocapture missions at places like the Earth or at Mars or at Titan can be very similar to those that are used with the Mars Exploration Rover missions. But if we're going to destinations such as Neptune, that would require a different vehicle shape, different aeroshell shape, and that would be more shaped like a bullet that flies at an angle. To achieve a successful Aerocapture, we have to stay within a very narrow corridor. If we don't stay within that corridor, we would have a flyby. We wouldn't capture into the orbit, or on the other side, we would land. And so it's very important to stay within a particular corridor through that destination. At Neptune, the corridor is narrower.
It's kind of like a little highway.
It's like a little highway. And so at Neptune, in order to make the highway bigger, we need to have a different shape.
So Dr. Lockwood, in addition to aeroshells, what are some other techniques that can be used to slow a vehicle down?
We're looking at other techniques that might be second generation techniques that would use an inflatable aeroshell or even a volute. A volute basically looks like a giant donut. It's got tethers similar to a parachute, but it has a giant ring behind it. And that allows the spacecraft to fly shallower in the atmosphere to still slow down. We are always working to achieve the science and exploration goals for NASA, and being able to reduce the cost of these systems and being able to improve the performance of the systems is a very important part of achieving that goal. And it's very exciting and challenging work.
Coming up, we'll find out how specialized materials are saving lives. But first,
did you know that aerobraking was first tested on the Magellan mission to Venus in 1994? Although the Magellan mission used propulsion to slow the craft, aerobraking was tested at the end of the mission to validate the theory. With the success of this test, NASA researchers decided to use aerobraking as the primary deceleration method on one of its next missions, the Mars Global Surveyor. On February 4, 1999, history was made when the Mars Global Surveyor successfully obtained stable circular orbit of Mars using aerobraking as the primary method of deceleration.